The wind howled through the empty highway as Jacob tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his headlights the only light cutting through the dense night. The sky threatened snow, and the road ahead was an endless, lonely stretch through the hills. It was late, and Jacob was exhausted from a full day of back-to-back meetings and the long drive home from a business trip. As he passed an old, nearly forgotten gas station, his gaze caught on a flicker of movement near the pumps. He slowed, almost instinctively, and his headlights fell in the figure of a woman, bundled tightly in a thin coat, shivering uncontrollably as she wrapped her arms around her body. Something in the scene felt haunting, her silhouette so stark and alone in the empty lot. He stopped the car and rolled down his window, calling out through the freezing air. "Are you all right?" he asked, trying to gauge the situation without alarming her. The woman turned, her face pale and eyes wide. Even from his car, Jacob could see that she looked cold to the bone, her cheeks flushed red from the chill. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes full of weariness, but desperation seemed to override her reluctance. I don't know if there's a bus or anything nearby," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "I was hoping. I didn't mean to bother anyone." Jacob stepped out of his car, his boots crunching against the icy gravel. He could feel the bitter wind slicing through his coat and immediately wondered how long she'd been out here in this weather. "Don't worry about it," he said gently, approaching her slowly. "Are you lost? Can I help you with anything?" She shifted, pulling her coat tighter around her. "My car broke down a few miles back. I tried walking, but then it got so cold." Her voice trailed off as she looked down, her expression fraught with worry. As Jacob drew closer, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small, but noticeable, roundness under her coat. She was pregnant. Panic flashed in his mind, and he realized that standing out here in the freezing cold was not only dangerous but could be deadly for her and the child. "Look, there's a hospital about 30 minutes from here," he said, his tone turning more urgent. "You need to warm up and get checked out. This weather isn't safe." The woman looked at him, relief and hesitation mingling in her expression. She nodded finally, letting him guide her into the passenger seat of his car. As they pulled out of the station, she murmured a quiet thank you, her voice barely above a whisper. The drive to the hospital was silent, save for the soft hum of the car's heater. The woman kept her hands clutched together, her gaze fixed on the dashboard as if deep in thought. Jacob noticed her glancing at him now and then, as if she wanted to say something, but she stayed silent. Finally, as they were nearing the hospital, Jacob decided to break the ice. "I'm Jacob, by the way," he said, offering her a small smile. "I'm glad I was able to find you out there." She gave a hesitant smile in return. "Thank you, Jacob. I'm Lily." "Lily, nice to meet you. I know this probably isn't where you expected to be tonight." He tried to keep his tone light, hoping to ease some of the tension. Lily looked down at her hands, her expression distant. "It wasn't. I didn't expect any of this." She paused, then sighed. "I'm just grateful you were there. I don't know what I would have done otherwise." Jacob's curiosity grew, but he sensed she wasn't ready to explain, so he nodded, allowing the silence to settle again. There was something about her that seemed fragile yet strong, like she was holding together pieces of herself that had been broken. As they reached the hospital, Jacob parked near the entrance and helped her out of the car. The emergency room was quiet, with only a few patients and a handful of nurses milling about. The warmth inside the hospital was a relief, and he noticed Lily visibly relax as they entered. He approached the nurse at the check-in desk, explaining briefly that he'd found her stranded and that she might need medical attention. The nurse nodded, taking down Lily's information, and then called for a doctor. As the hospital staff led her into an exam room, she glanced back at Jacob, giving him a grateful nod. "Thank you again, Jacob," she said softly. You saved me tonight." Jacob smiled, feeling a strange sense of attachment to this woman he'd only just met. It's no problem, Lily. Get some rest. I'll wait out here, just in case. She nodded and disappeared behind the doors, leaving Jacob alone in the quiet waiting area. An hour passed, and Jacob had nearly dozed off in his chair when a doctor finally approached him. "Are you here with Lily?" the doctor asked. Jacob straightened, nodding. "Yes, I am. Is she all right?" The doctor gave him a reassuring smile. "She's fine. We've warmed her up, and the baby is healthy. She'll need some rest, but everything's looking good." Relieved, Jacob let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He thanked the doctor and leaned back, ready to leave now that he knew she was safe. But as he stood up to go, a voice stopped him. "Jacob?" He turned to see Lily, standing just inside the doorway, wrapped in a hospital blanket. She looked more relaxed now, her face softer, as if the warmth had brought back some color to her cheeks. "I didn't expect you to wait," she said, a faint smile on her lips. Jacob shrugged, grinning. "Well, I wanted to make sure you were okay. I didn't want to leave you here alone." She gave him a grateful nod, and they stood there, an awkward silence filling the space between them. Finally, Jacob cleared his throat. "Do you have someone to call? Family or friends?" At this, Lily's smile faltered, and a shadow passed over her face. "No. Not really. I'm alone." Jacob's heart sank. There was a deep sadness in her eyes, a sense of isolation that he recognized all too well. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "You've already done more for me than anyone has in a long time. I don't know how to thank you." Jacob's mind raced. Here was this stranger, someone he'd stumbled upon by chance on a freezing night, and yet he felt a connection to her, or responsibility almost. He knew what it felt like to have nowhere to turn. "Do you need a place to stay?" he offered, the word surprising even himself. "I have a spare room, and it's a lot better than staying in some motel." Lily looked at him, her eyes widening. "I couldn't ask you to do that, Jacob." "You're not asking," he replied, his voice firm but kind. "I'm offering. You need some stability, at least for now, and I'd feel better knowing you're somewhere safe." For a moment, Lily seemed on the verge of tears, her emotions just barely contained. She took a deep breath and nodded, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know why you're doing this, but thank you." Jacob shrugged, a soft smile on his face. "Sometimes, we all need a little kindness." They left the hospital together, and as they drove through the quiet, empty streets, Jacob felt a strange calm settle over him. It was as if, in helping her, he'd found a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Lily was quiet beside him, her gaze turned toward the window, lost in thought. When they arrived at Jacob's modest home, he showed her to the guest room, making sure she had everything she needed. She thanked him once more, her voice soft and filled with emotion. As Jacob closed the door behind him, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lily's story, a mystery hidden beneath her guarded smile. He knew it wasn't his place to pry, but a part of him hoped that, with time, she might open up. And as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, Jacob couldn't help but wonder who this woman really was, and what twists of fate had brought her into his life. The days following Lily's arrival passed quietly, yet Jacob found his curiosity about her growing with each moment. She seemed grateful for the shelter but kept to herself, and although she was polite and appreciative, Jacob could sense a certain guardedness in her, a subtle reluctance to reveal more than necessary. He wanted to respect her privacy, but the questions lingered in his mind. One evening, as they both sat in the small kitchen over dinner, Jacob decided to try and break the ice. "How are you feeling?" he asked, careful to keep his tone light. Lily glanced up, offering a small smile. "Better, thanks to you. I don't think I would have made it through that night without your help." He smiled, nodding. "I'm glad you're all right. It's been nice having some company." actually. He hesitated, then added, you mentioned you were on your own. Do you have any family nearby? Her face grew still, and for a moment, she looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together in a nervous gesture. No, not really, she said finally, her voice soft. Things have been complicated for a while now. Jacob nodded, sensing her discomfort. I understand. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs. She looked up, a flicker of relief in her eyes, as if his understanding gave her permission to share a little more. I was on my way to a new town, looking for work. I thought I could find a fresh start, but my car broke down, and well, you know the rest. There was a sadness in her voice that Jacob recognized. It reminded him of the quiet pain he'd carried for years after his divorce, the loneliness that had settled in his heart as he tried to rebuild his life on his own. He could see that same struggle in Lily's eyes, the same longing for a new beginning. I've been there, he said softly. Sometimes, a fresh start is exactly what you need. And sometimes, you end up finding more than you were looking for. She looked at him, curiosity sparking in her eyes. You sound like you know something about starting over. He laughed lightly. Let's just say, life's thrown a few curveballs my way, too. I went through a rough patch a few years ago, a divorce, actually. I thought it was the end of the world, but it forced me to take a hard look at my life and what I wanted. Lily's expression softened, and for a moment, the guardedness in her gaze eased. It sounds like you found your way through it, she said quietly. Jacob nodded. It wasn't easy, but eventually, I realized that I had a choice. I could let it drag me down, or I could start over. I chose to rebuild. She seemed to ponder this, as if weighing her own situation against his words. I think I'd like to believe that's possible, she murmured, almost to herself. A comfortable silence fell between them, and Jacob felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was getting through to her. He wanted to offer her more than just a roof over her head. He wanted her to know that she had a friend, someone who understood her pain and wanted to help her heal. The next few days settled into a quiet routine. Lily began helping around the house, tidying up the kitchen, and even cooking a few simple meals. She moved with an efficiency that suggested experience, and Jacob appreciated the subtle ways she made his home feel warmer, more lived in. One afternoon, as they both cleaned up after lunch, Jacob noticed something unusual. Lily's phone lay on the counter, but the screen was cracked, and the device looked like it had seen better days. She noticed his gaze and gave a small, embarrassed smile. It's barely working, she admitted. I dropped it a while ago, and it hasn't been the same since. Jacob nodded, filing the information away. It explained why she hadn't reached out to anyone. Well, maybe we can get it looked at. A good phone repair shop might be able to fix it up. Her face brightened for a moment, but then she shook her head, glancing away. I don't think that's necessary. The way she dismissed the suggestion left Jacob with a feeling he couldn't shake. It was as if she were trying to avoid something, to hide from the outside world. He reminded himself to be patient, to let her open up in her own time. But that night, as he lay awake, Jacob couldn't help but wonder what had truly brought her to that gas station. There was more to her story, he was certain of it. The following weekend, Jacob decided to go into town to pick up a few groceries and offered to take Lily along. She seemed hesitant at first, but he assured her that it might do her good to get out of the house for a bit. She eventually agreed, and they drove into town together, the quiet of the car filled with the low hum of the radio. As they walked through the aisles, Jacob noticed Lily's gaze drifting over the items on the shelves with a look of longing. He realized she had been holding herself back, keeping her needs minimal, as if afraid to take up space in his life. It tugged at his heart, and he decided to take matters into his own hands, filling the cart with extra items he thought she might like. They were nearing the checkout when a small boy bumped into Lily, causing her to stumble slightly. She smiled down at him, reaching out to steady him, but before the boy's mother could apologize, her expression changed to one of shock. "Oh, my goodness," the woman stammered, her eyes widening as she looked at Lily. "You look just like—" The woman trailed off, clearly realizing that she'd spoken too openly, and hurriedly ushered her son away. Lily's face had gone pale, and Jacob noticed her hands trembling slightly as she steadied herself. "Lily, are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. She gave him a forced smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, I'm fine. Just startled." But as they left the store, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply troubling her, something she hadn't yet shared. The encounter had shaken her, and he could see her retreating back into her shell, growing quieter and more withdrawn as they made their way back home. That night, Jacob found himself sitting at the kitchen table, lost in thought. He had given Lily space, respected her boundaries, but he was beginning to feel that if she didn't open up soon, whatever was haunting her might consume her entirely. The next morning, as they sat together over breakfast, Jacob decided to take a chance. "Lily, I hope you know that you don't have to carry this burden alone," he said gently. "Whatever you're going through, I'm here to listen, if you ever want to talk." She looked at him, a flicker of pain in her eyes, and for a moment, he thought she might finally tell him. But instead, she gave him a sad smile, shaking her head. "Thank you, Jacob," she whispered. "I appreciate it more than you know. But some things are hard to share." Jacob reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "I understand. Just know that you're not alone. Whatever it is, you have someone who cares." She gave a small nod, and he could see the gratitude in her gaze. But there was still a wall there, something she wasn't ready to let him see. That night, as Jacob prepared for bed, he heard a soft knock at his door. Surprised, he opened it to find Lily standing there, her expression tense. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't been honest about." Jacob's heart pounded as he stepped aside, letting her in. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I wasn't completely honest about my situation," she began, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I wasn't just looking for a fresh start. I was running away." Jacob's chest tightened as he listened, sensing the weight of her confession. "There are people who are looking for me. People who might be dangerous. And that night at the gas station, I was trying to stay out of sight. I thought I could disappear, but it's harder than I expected." He felt a surge of protectiveness, understanding that her journey had been far more harrowing than he'd realized. "Lily, whatever's going on, I'll help you. You don't have to go through this alone." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and relief. "Thank you, Jacob. I don't know what I did to deserve your kindness." He reached out, squeezing her hand. "We'll figure this out together." As they sat in the quiet, Jacob knew that this was only the beginning of a difficult road ahead. But one thing was clear: he would stand by her, no matter what secrets or dangers lay in her past. The morning after Lily's confession, the atmosphere in Jacob's home was thick with unspoken tension. Despite her relief at finally opening up, Lily was anxious, and Jacob sensed that she was still holding back crucial parts of her story. Over the past few days, he had become determined to help her, but he knew they couldn't go forward without trust. If she was truly in danger, he needed to understand what they were dealing with. Over breakfast, he sat across from her, studying her face. She looked tired, as if the weight of her secrets had finally taken its toll. He decided to press her gently. "Lily, you don't have to tell me everything," he began carefully. "But if we're going to figure this out, I need to know the truth. Who's after you?" She looked up at him, hesitation evident in her eyes. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice trembling. "His name is Samuel Reed. He's my ex-husband." The name hung in the air, and Jacob's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected this. She continued, her gaze distant, as if she were reliving painful memories. Samuel comes from a powerful family, she explained. On the surface, he seemed charming, respectable. But behind closed doors, he was a very different person. Controlling, possessive, he saw me as his possession, not as a person. It took me a long time to realize how dangerous he truly was. Jacob clenched his fists under the table, feeling a surge of anger on her behalf. He understood now why she had been so guarded, so hesitant to share her past. He could only imagine what she had gone through. One night, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, I managed to escape. I took what little money I had and ran. I didn't want to go to the police because his family has connections, people who would protect him. I thought if I could just disappear, I could be free of him. But, she trailed off, her eyes filling with fear. I think he's still looking for me. I saw someone watching me a few towns back, and I've been running ever since. Jacob took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Lily, if he's dangerous, you need protection. Have you considered going to a shelter or contacting a support group? She shook her head. I'm afraid that any trace I leave will lead into me. And now? I don't want to put you in danger, Jacob. You've already done so much for me. If Samuel finds out where I am, he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Jacob's heart ached for her, and a fierce protectiveness surged within him. You don't have to go through this alone. I won't let him hurt you. I'll do everything I can to keep you safe. Lily's eyes filled with tears as she looked at him. Thank you, Jacob. I don't know what I'd do without you. Determined to help her, Jacob made a plan. He reached out to an old friend from college, a private investigator named Max who had experience dealing with situations like these. Max agreed to meet with them discreetly, understanding the sensitive nature of Lily's predicament. When Max arrived later that evening, he listened carefully as Lily recounted her story, filling in more details about Samuel's influence and connections. Max's face grew serious, and he nodded, taking notes as she spoke. This isn't the first case I've handled involving powerful families who think they're above the law, Max said grimly. But it sounds like he's relentless. I can dig around and see if there's any chatter about him looking for you. In the meantime, we need to keep a low profile and make sure you're not being followed. Max advised them to take extra precautions, suggesting that Lily avoid public places and stay off social media or anything that could reveal her location. He also offered to set up surveillance around Jacob's property in case anyone suspicious came around. As the days passed, they remained vigilant. Lily stayed indoors, helping Jacob around the house and finding solace in the quiet safety of his home. Their connection grew stronger, and Jacob found himself caring for her more deeply than he had anticipated. Despite the fear that loomed over them, he felt a sense of purpose in protecting her, a purpose he hadn't felt in years. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Jacob noticed a flicker of worry in her eyes. What's on your mind? He asked, reaching out to take her hand. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely a whisper. I keep thinking, if Samuel finds me, he'll stop at nothing. And I can't bear the thought of putting you in harm's way. Jacob squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. You don't have to worry about me. We're in this together, and I won't let him hurt you. Not now, not ever. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. In that moment, he saw the depth of her vulnerability, the trust she had placed in him despite everything she had been through. He leaned closer, his heart pounding, and before he knew it, their lips met in a soft, tender kiss. It was a quiet promise, an affirmation that he was there for her, no matter what. A few days later, Max called with an update. I've been digging around, he said, his tone serious. And I found out that Samuel has been actively looking for Lily. He's hired people to keep tabs on her movements, but they haven't been able to track her down, yet. Jacob's stomach twisted with anger and fear. He had hoped that Samuel would have given up by now, but it was clear that this man wasn't going to stop. Max advised them to stay cautious, especially in public, as Samuel's contacts could be closer than they thought. Over the next week, the tension grew. Every knock at the door, every passing car, felt like a potential threat. Jacob could feel Lily's anxiety increasing, and he knew they couldn't keep living like this indefinitely. They needed a plan, a way to keep her safe permanently. Finally, Max suggested a solution. "There's a program," he explained. "It's for people who are in situations like Lily's, where the threat level is high and the usual protections aren't enough. They can help relocate her, give her a new identity, a fresh start." Lily looked at him, hope and fear mingling in her expression. "A new identity? You mean I'd have to leave everything behind?" Max nodded. "Yes. It's not easy, but it's a way to disappear completely, to start over without looking over your shoulder." The thought of losing touch with Jacob, the one person who had shown her kindness and safety, was heartbreaking. But deep down, she knew it might be her only chance for freedom. Jacob took her hands, his gaze intense. "Whatever you choose, I'm here. If you want to stay, we'll fight this together. But if leaving is the only way you can feel safe, I'll support you every step of the way." Lily's heart ached as she looked into his eyes. She wanted to stay, to build a life with him, but she couldn't ignore the danger that followed her. After a long silence, she nodded, her decision made. I think I have to go," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't want to keep running, Jacob. I want to be free." Jacob nodded, his heart heavy but understanding. "Then let's make sure you get that freedom." In the days that followed, Max worked with his contacts to arrange Lily's relocation. It was a painful process, filled with goodbyes and the knowledge that they might never see each other again. But Jacob knew it was the only way for her to truly start over. On the morning of her departure, they shared a final moment together, holding each other tightly. "Thank you for everything, Jacob," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude and sorrow. "You've given me hope again. I'll never forget you." He kissed her gently, his heart breaking as he let her go. "Stay safe, Lily. And remember, you're stronger than he could ever know." With one last, lingering look, Lily stepped into the car that would take her to her new life. As she drove away, Jacob felt a profound emptiness, but also a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had helped her find the freedom she deserved. Months passed, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy for Jacob. He missed Lily deeply, but he took comfort in the knowledge that she was safe, somewhere far from the shadow of her past. One day, as he checked his mailbox, he found a simple envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a picture of a small house with a garden, and a note written in familiar handwriting. "Thank you for everything. I finally found peace." A smile touched Jacob's lips as he folded the note and placed it back in the envelope. Lily had found her fresh start, and even though she was gone, he knew he'd made a difference in her life. And in helping her, he had found a sense of purpose, a quiet peace he hadn't known he was looking for. For Jacob, life would go on, but the memory of that freezing night, the chance encounter, and the courage they had both shown would stay with him forever.